the administration has scheduled oil and gas leases up through September of this year. They didn't have any basically in the last quarter of last year or the first quarter of this year, which have really frustrated not environmental groups, but Republicans and oil and gas industry groups who want regular leasing. But it's starting to pick back up because of this law. And the Biden administration has just held it basically its first oil and gas lease sale, the first in a series throughout this year. And so it's kind of a rejuvenation of this program.
Welcome to Reporter's Notebook, where we talk to the Washington Examiner's top journalists about the stories breaking on their beats. I'm Jim Antle. I'm joined today by Energy and Environment Reporter Jeremy Beaman. Jeremy, the G7 summit is behind us. President Biden has come home. What are some of the things on the environmental front that occurred? Were there any settlements, any results?
The big takeaway on the environmental front was the G7 endorsed limited investment in natural gas. This is something G7 endorsed last year, but they carried it over again this year. Basically, when they all get together, they say, what do we want to tell the world we support? What do we want to stand for? And the fact that they have stood again for investment in natural gas tells a lot about how the 7 most biggest economies in the world, excluding China, view fossil fuels and their place in the global economy. The way they view it is that we're going to need new gas infrastructure, gas to import liquefied infrastructure to import liquefied natural gas to various countries around the world. And this is a challenge for really all of the G7, especially for the Biden administration, that sort of ran on a strong climate change agenda, one that was really based on limiting fossil fuel extraction, especially new extraction and investment, and something they've come around to embrace because of the energy crisis that the world saw last year.
So the Biden administration has had some setbacks on environmental issues at the Supreme Court. Talk a little bit about what some of those legal battles have looked like.
The biggest one here, the latest one, is a decision in a case called Sackett versus EPA, and it's a case that really was initiated almost 2 decades ago by this Idaho couple. Wanted to build a home in Idaho, and they ran afoul of the Clean Water Act. And this is, the Clean Water Act regulates navigable waters all around the United States, and this basically, under the law, you define waters of the United States, what is included in that. And over the years, different administrations have defined it differently. Mm-hmm. But basically, the court ruled that all of with the exception that maybe of the Trump administrations, all of these definitions have swept too widely, mm-hmm. and they really narrowed the scope of the amount of, not the amount, but the bodies of water, the features that can be regulated by the federal government. And so Republicans had hoped for this outcome. Landowner interests, agricultural interests, home builders had sought this outcome. They'd all said for years that WOTUS, as it's known, Waters of the United States, mm-hmm. is too broad, and people just want to build a home, and they're running into this law because they can't, dig up and dump dirt in a place that might run afoul of waters of the United States. So it's a win, really, for those interests.
So there seems to have been a general trend of the Supreme Court narrowing what the executive branch can do, sort of narrowing and limiting their discretion on how to implement various things that have been passed as a statute by Congress.
Yeah, and this case is one example. The even bigger one is West Virginia v. EPA, which had to do with regulating greenhouse gas emissions from power plants. And that really has set a striking precedent that you're seeing Republicans invoke for multiple rules that the Biden administration has proposed, and saying, look, we have this precedent in West Virginia v. EPA, which to a degree said these major questions that agencies try to address via regulation ought to be left to Congress, and so for things like the new vehicle regulations that the Biden administration has proposed, we very likely will see Republican states challenge that rule, referencing probably as a primary case that one that I mentioned, West Virginia v. EPA.
So there's been some movement on oil and gas leasing. Talk a little bit about that.
So the leasing onshore has been very intermittent during the Biden administration. So Biden came into office having said he wanted to restrict it up to and including banning, new drilling and leasing. And he early on during his administration, he implemented a pause, which was eventually held up in court. But in the last 8 months or so, since August, the tide has kind of turned because the Inflation Reduction Act, this is the energy and healthcare spending bill that Democrats passed without Republican support last year. It actually included language that Senator Joe Manchin had required to be included in the bill that kind of forced the administration's hand on leasing and basically tied new leasing to renewable energy development on federal lands. So to do one, they have to do the other. Really, to do renewable energy development, they have to lease regularly. And so since then, the administration has scheduled oil and gas leases up through September of this year. They didn't have any basically in the last quarter of last year or the first quarter of this year, which have really frustrated not environmental groups, but Republicans and oil and gas industry groups who want regular leasing. But it's starting to pick back up because of this law. And the Biden administration has just held it basically its first oil and gas lease sale, the first in a series throughout this year. And so it's kind of a rejuvenation of this program.
What you mentioned, though, does seem to be a general theme with this in particular, but also energy and issues in general, in that it seems that the Biden administration finds itself sort of stuck in the middle, where it's not doing enough for producers to make them happy, not doing enough for environmental groups and climate change activists to make them happy, and they're kind of sort of in this middle ground.
Well, and I imagine that this is common for presidential candidates who run on aspirational platforms and then have to govern, in much more narrow constraints, and that's certainly what Biden has faced, and those constraints have been put in place by the courts in some cases, but in this case, it's a true irony, really, that the signature law that the Democrats passed is one that sort of both propels their green energy and climate change agenda and also constrains it because of these concessions on leasing that Manchin forced in there.
Yeah, I mean, it's basically, it was their big climate bill, but it's also a Joe Manchin bill, substantially.
Right, and Manchin and the larger Democratic Party and Biden, too, have marketed this bill very differently. For Manchin, it is an energy security bill, an all-of-the-above bill, which is really a Republican term that we're seeing. And of course, for Democrats, it's a climate bill. So they're emphasizing the pieces of it that they like the most, I think.
That does tend to be how these things work. Thank you, Jeremy.
Thanks.
You can read Jeremy and subscribe to our Daily on Energy newsletter at washingtonexaminer.com.